about today? Well, the threat is hundreds of organisations, large and small, fall victim to cyber attack every day. And the reputational and operational and financial costs to those businesses can be very high. A few stats which come from a PwC report from the government as well. 90% of large organisations had a security breach in 2015. 70% of small organisations had a security breach in 2015. And the average cost for those small organisations to remedy was £73,000 to £310,000. Most security breaches are preventable, and 47 of those involve a malicious attack that's reliant on a human being, so either ignorance or negligence of that human. And 25% of breaches come through a contractor or a supplier. And we should all accept, all of our businesses should accept that we're going to breach at some point, whether that's now or later in the future, you will breach in some form. So how can cyber awareness training help? Well, you will reduce the chance of your organisation breaching due to a data breach. You need to change people's behaviour, and it requires more than just teaching materials or classroom training. And in partnership with Axelos, we provide an awareness platform and all of the digital tools you need for an all-round cybersecurity awareness campaign to drive real and lasting change in the security culture inside your organisation. We're going to target your frontline staff, all of your staff, not just the boardroom, not just management, but everybody within your organisation. The platform itself, I'm not going to talk too much, so I don't want to steal the thunder, but it's simple, it's constantly updated in terms of material. It's developed by experts, behavioural, cyber experts as well. The content is engaging, and you can measure the results, which is really important, also for GDPR. So I'm going to hand you over to Nick and Richard. Richard is a strategic advisor to Axelos, specialising in management of digital risk and the development of effective digital resilience and awareness programs. Richard was the corporate security director of Vodafone between 2009 and 2015. Nick, sitting in the middle, is responsible for Resilia at Axelos, the product we're talking about today. And prior to that, Nick spent 11 years at Detica, now BAE Systems, where he led their cybersecurity engagement team. And we've also got my colleague Ian, our head of governance and compliance at Sprout, who's available for Q&A at the end as well. So once we've heard from Richard and Nick, we'll have an open forum for questions, and we will do our best to answer all of those for you. So I'll hand you over to Nick and Richard.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I've spent the period since 2005 working in corporate security, and I've come to a clear conclusion. Nobody is really very interested in cybersecurity or gives it a priority. And so what I'd like to do is to spend perhaps a few minutes defending that thesis in front of a group of lawyers, which is rather intimidating, really to set the scene for why we regard culture as something that's so important for everybody. So I start really with an historical analogy. Let's imagine that we've gone back to prehistory and we're sitting in the early evening in our cave after a hard day of whatever it is you did in prehistoric times. It's getting dark, you've lit your little fire, and you start hearing a pack of roaring wild animals outside the cave. Now what you do not do in that situation is go outside for a David Attenborough moment, obviously, to bond with the animals. You retreat into the cave, you build up the fire, and you hope for the best. What's the relevance of that analogy? Let's think about the cyber world, the digital world, which has been with us, let's say, for about 30 years, not the 50 or 60,000 years during which we developed the automatic, inbuilt, wired-in safety responses that our prehistoric ancestors were showing in not going outside to confront the animal, but withdrawing into the cave. It's only since 2007, it seems incredible to believe it, only since 2007 that we've had iPhones, that we've had smartphones in the way that we understand them. So we simply have not had that period to build up the wired-in responses about safety, about security that we need in the digital world. But it goes beyond that because, of course, we're all humans and we all have our own behaviours. It's a well-known fact, I think, that if you look at campaigns against smoking, against alcohol abuse, against gambling, against unprotected sex, and don't worry, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, it's clear that people, even though they know the risks, are as likely to complain about the nanny state lecturing them and to carry on doing it anyway as they are to heed the warnings. And why do they do that? Because, of course, they think it won't happen to me. There's another factor as well, which is really to do with the dopamine effect, the fact that these devices very often are addictive. And I had a little demonstration of that with this slide. We're all very familiar, I think, with this scene. I live in Italy and am constantly being bumped off the pavement by people like this. And then I like to think that 20 years on, this is the same group of people. And he's got a slight smile, probably just heard about a refresher. So these are situations in which behaviours, our natural inbuilt reaction to things, are being driven. And this is in our private lives. Let's now translate this into the working environment. As in our private lives, the digital world has brought huge benefits in terms of speed, efficiency, just the ability to get things done very well, very quickly. And what we don't want is somebody like me coming along and raining on the parade and saying, yes, but. Because security people are always regarded as those people who add complication and cost and slow everything down. And I had a good example of this early in my time in Vodafone. Vodafone, in the middle noughties, was having a long debate with itself about the direction it should take. Should it remain just a provider of services, what's known in the trade as a dumb pipe, or should it actually try to develop its own products, smartphones, for example? And the decision was taken that we should develop our own smartphone device. It was called Vodafone 365. And a CEO was appointed to the business that was to develop all of this. And I spent almost a year trying to get access to this guy because I wanted to discuss with him the security which he was building into this new device. It took me 9 months, and eventually I got an interview with the great man who said with a smile, I've told all my people to keep you security people as far away as possible because you're simply going to add cost, complicate things and slow everything down. I've got a deadline to meet to launch this product. Well, cut to the chase, 6 months later the product had failed and he was out of a job. The product didn't fail because of security, but a large component of the failure was the fact that he did not involve us at the beginning of security. There were a number of serious security flaws which simply hadn't been taken into account and which had to be fixed. And this was a contributing factor to the failure of the product in the longer term. So the other problem, I think, and I suspect I have some sympathy in this audience, is that the people in businesses who are running systems at the top end are not going to be technology people, they're going to be arts graduates. How many people here are technology graduates? Probably one, okay. That's a high average in my experience of talking this sort of event. And so there is a tendency, first of all, of a lack of understanding and a lack of willingness to understand very often at the heads of companies by people who think this is a technical problem, this is for anoraks and nerds, let's push it onto them. And in extreme examples, you'll see cases where the tendency is simply to throw a bunch of money at the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, or the person responsible for security, and tell them just to get on with it. Well, I'm the last person ever to criticize my technology colleagues. They do a very important, essential job. But my main thesis in all of this is that actually, however important the technology is, this is actually all about people. And let's talk this through a little bit and think about it. The first area in which it's people is, of course, that the people who program our IT systems to defend them against the threats we're facing are responding to an ever expanding, ever developing, ever complicating risk landscape, to use the technical jargon, where it's very, very hard for them even to think of keeping up. The classic example of that is that even sophisticated states, the United States is the example I'm going to give you, cannot always hope to defeat serious directed cyber attacks. And in 2015, the United States Office of Personnel Management, OPM, suffered a major hack which exposed, wait for the figure, the personal identifiable information of 21 million existing, current, and former federal employees, including the status of their security clearances and all the data that's collected on people when they have to be cleared for security purposes. 21 million people's records were exposed. Oh, I missed that bit out, never mind. When the House Oversight Committee looked into this, this was the conclusion they came to. It wasn't about the technology, it was a failure of culture and leadership, not technology. And we can see that in other respects in business as well, and I'll give you a couple of examples. Again, it's people who are responsible for the prioritization and the policy making within any organization. And those people with the best will in the world will make mistakes. A few years ago, I was advising on security in a company that was going through a major merger, a big merger. Tens of billions of dollars were involved. And the board sat down and thought very carefully about their strategy for this merger. And the conclusion they came to, and which they announced publicly, was that our major priority in this merger is around process and people. Now, there was, and that was a perfectly credible thing to say, of course. The employees reading between the lines, as soon as there was going to be a focus on people and it was a merger, of course, immediately began to worry. That depressed morale within the organization. But the fact was that because they put all of that emphasis on that place and ignored the very loud warnings that I was giving and others were giving on the security side and the main board audit committee side, there was in fact pretty rapidly a major cybersecurity breach which caused huge problems within the organization. Reputationally, it was a huge disaster in the press and so on. Again, it's people. And finally, what I don't want to call too much the little people, but ordinary people like you and me working in companies day in, day out and using the systems. These are the people who are human for all the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning. They make mistakes willingly or unwillingly, and they don't need to be malicious, although of course some people will be malicious. That person in the company who hasn't been rewarded or recognized or promoted, perhaps as they think they should have been, and may take the opportunity to take revenge on the company by screwing it up a little bit. We do see that, the so-called insider threat, as it's known in the business. So I put a huge emphasis on security, and why have I done that? The simple fact is that cyber attacks, as Matt has already said, are coming to a place near you soon. In fact, they probably already have, and it's just that you don't know it. Matt mentioned some statistics, let me give you some other ones. This is the latest PwC law survey that I've seen. I was saying to somebody at the beginning of this talk that I see these statistics across lots of different sectors. They're all more or less similar. I would say these are on the low side. I suspect they understate what's actually happened. But 60% of all law firms reported some form of security incident in 2017. I suspect another 20% didn't know they'd had one. 42% of law firms were targets of phishing attacks on a regular basis. And 55% of firms were targeted by cyber attacks using malware. It's very serious, and yet it's still underestimated, I think, across all sectors. I'm doing work at the moment in the marine sector, banking, oil and gas, and it's a real problem at the top of those companies very often to get them taken seriously, and I think we'll hear a little bit more on that in the context of GDPR later on. It's a huge issue. If we look a little bit at the legal sector, I'm not a lawyer, But the cases that I've seen, the obvious case that everybody talks about was last June 2017, the DLA Piper case. Interesting to me because I'd actually worked with DLA Piper quite a lot in the United States in a non-profit that I was working with. Embarrassing for them, of course, because they regarded and regard themselves as big experts on cyber security. And the effect of the attack on them was that for 3 days they had no access to their internal phone system and no access to their emails. Some may regard this as paradise. But the fact was, it seriously messed up the company and its operations. What happened? Well, without going into too many technical details, it was a ransomware attack, and you probably know about ransomware. It's a system by which crooks smuggle malware onto your systems, which encrypt all the data that you have and block access to it until you pay them a ransom to have a key to unlock everything. A ransom normally demanded in Bitcoin, so it's easily transferable and not traceable. Let's think a little bit, coming back to people. I said smuggled onto their systems. How was it smuggled onto their systems? The simplest method of all, there are various ways, but the simplest method of all, in an email, which brings us back to the ordinary person in the company. That ordinary person could be at the top or could be at the bottom of the company, but an ordinary person somewhere clicked on a malicious link which downloaded the software onto the system. I keep saying it's all about people. And this is where I'm going to conclude and then hand over to Nick. Cyber attacks succeed, in my experience, where people are ignorant, lazy, or apathetic. Or sometimes, of course, there are cases where they're malicious. But generally, people don't know, they're not well informed, they're lazy. Well, we're all lazy. We'll all tend to do the thing that's simple and quick, or apathetic, don't really care. Nick's now going to talk to us, I think, a little bit about how we can do something to change the culture in an organisation, because for me this is a cultural issue. It's not a technical issue. It's really, as I keep on saying, about people. And there are quite clear steps that we can all take to change things within organisations. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to be less brave than Richard. I'm going to stand behind the lectern. Morning, everyone. Delighted to be here this morning. Just a couple of points just to pick up from Richard's presentation, first of all. Firstly, he talked about reputation, and certainly the thing that we find in working with lots of our clients, particularly at a more senior level in those organisations, is that this is all about reputation. And the thing that gets people exercised most is beginning to look at the way in which some of these attacks can significantly and catastrophically impact corporate reputation, but also personal reputation. So when we get to the top of those organisations, it's as much about their own personal reputation as corporate. And secondly, Richard highlighted this issue of prevention and making sure that we build a culture where we're not waiting for the crisis to happen. And all too often we do see organisations doing stuff after it's too late, after an attack. And we need to get people thinking about the fact that this is going to happen to them, and they need to take preventative measures, one of which is around building the insight and awareness and confidence with all of their people to do the right thing at the right time. Houston, we have a problem. So the global level of investment in cybersecurity technologies continues to skyrocket. It has done for many, many years, and I suspect it will continue over the next few years. But at the same time, the number, scale, and impact of cyber attacks in organisations is doing exactly the same. So there does seem to be something fundamentally missing in our organisational response to the cyber risks that we face. And the hard reality is that the vast majority of successful cyber attacks ultimately rely on human error. The annual Verizon annual data breach report from 2015, 2016, 2017, it's the Bible for chief information security officers around the world, regularly states upwards of 90% of successful attacks ultimately rely on any one of us doing something we shouldn't do. And typically we define that as the unwitting errors. The malicious attacks, the insider, they are there, but typically these are unwitting mistakes made by people across an organisation. Whether you're in the boardroom at the most senior levels within an organisation, or whether you're on the front line and anyone else in between, it impacts everybody. And therefore everybody has got a critical and very specific role to play in protecting their organisation's most valuable information, their reputation and their competitive advantage. It does remain remarkably easy for any attacker or attack group to compromise an organisation. I will suggest that all too often cyber attackers find it easier to communicate with, engage with and influence the behaviours of our own people than we do, which is a bit of a scary thought. There was after the WannaCry attack, I saw a live interview on BBC on a Saturday morning. It had a cyber expert speaking from an outside studio, spoke very eloquently about the sophistication of the WannaCry attack. Came back into the studio and the interviewer turned to this, it looked like a 15, 16-year-old boy. He was a hacker who'd turned good. And she said, do you agree with everything that's just been said? He said, well, I can't disagree, but can I just say just how easy it is? This is a ransomware attack. It's an email. It requires someone to open up an email. That is how easy it is. There was an article in the press, the national press, about 8 or 9 months ago, from a statement from the National Cybersecurity Centre, who wanted to tell the UK economy and the businesses in the UK about the activities of a particular Chinese attack group. They're called APT1. They've been around for many, many years, very active, and wanted to tell UK business, but particularly managed service providers, that their activities targeting them, UK managed service providers in particular, was on a rapid increase. The article in the press and all the papers that I read had long convoluted quotes and talking about how sophisticated all of this is and the sky's falling down, etc. For me, the story was in the penultimate paragraph, which simply stated the way in which these attacks are activated is through an email, a phishing email. That to me is the story, and that's what sort of, I think there's an issue here and a challenge for media to actually mature in the way in which they're reporting on this. So for me, we really do need to recognise the society, as a society, that our resilience to these attacks is as much about our people and their behaviours as it is about technology or compliance with the latest regulations and standards. There are challenges. There are phenomenal challenges, as Richard said, in changing behaviours and sustaining that behaviour change across an organisation, and making sure that the training you're providing your people is effective and is fit for purpose for your organisation. There is no one size fits all, and depending on the nature of your organisation, there are particular approaches you should be taking. The other thing we all know, 24 hours to go, is I think we are entering into, hopefully, a brave new world, where I believe data privacy and cybersecurity are increasingly going to be discussed in the same conversation. We can't have privacy without security, and you can't have security without privacy. And it's obviously apparent from the ICO, looking at, I've just seen a stunning mistake there, I apologise, prize for the person that spots it first, that the ICO is not going to be satisfied with seeing that you are just doing training, you are just ticking that box. That training that you're delivering for your people has to be effective, and it needs to be demonstrable. So our aim essentially is to make security and data protection behaviours commonplace for all organisations, part of the DNA within the organisations. We need people to think that it's the way we do things around here, and that does take time. But there is this fundamental challenge, and I wonder whether this cartoon might look familiar. And I apologise if there is anybody called Dave in the audience. It's not just people called Dave that make mistakes. But as we've heard, many organisations still continue to believe that technology, which does play an absolutely critical role in anybody's response to the risks we face, is the only thing, is the only solution. And we do need to recognise that human behaviour actually lies at the heart of the reason why many attacks happen. So there was UK government research last year that highlighted that only 20% of organisations in the UK provide any sort of training to their people in this space, cybersecurity awareness training. Of those that do, the vast majority, over 80%, continue to rely on annual tick box compliance-based training. Once a year, typically, and we've seen it time and time again with organisations, that they tell all their staff and mandate all their staff to take a 1 hour, 1.5 hour computer-based training package. There you go. It's as if we're trying to program our people in the way that we program our computers and expecting our people to do the things that we want our computers to do. It doesn't work, I'm very pleased to say, with people. So there is a different way, and training does need to be effective. At the moment, this sort of approach, it's as if training's being done to you. It's something that you have to do. People learn best when they want to learn, not when they're told to learn. I know that very much with my children. When you tell them something, they need to have some sort of incentive, and they need to enjoy what they're doing. It needs to be fun. And many mistakes are made when providing learning, saying just don't do this, don't do that, without providing any context. It doesn't work. A reliance on a single approach, computer-based training, it doesn't work. Different people learn in different ways, so give them a lively mix of formats to learn and create their own preferred learning style. So, in developing the training that Matt and the team at Sprout IT are working with us on and have partnered with us on, we've applied 4 core principles. We have just added a GDPR training course in the last few weeks, and there's another one coming on, so that's for all staff. And we have just launched one for data owners specifically as well. Slightly more technical, slightly more longer in its scope. So the principles we've applied to the development of our learning. What we've done, worked very hard, is try and combine what that very simple best practice guidance should be for all people, together with and working with information security experts, but also working with behavioural psychologists and learning experts who understand how people learn best, and trying to crash those together. So engaging, relevant and valuable. Our learning is based on short, nugget-sized learning. Average attention span for most adults, about 9 or 10 minutes. So to expect people to learn anything on a 1-hour training course, not really particularly effective. So all our online modules should take no longer than 10 minutes to complete. Most of it's 2-3 minutes, designed to remind, refresh and reinforce the training that's provided. Make it easy to understand. One of my big frustrations, I think I'd probably say I'm in the security industry, I have been for the last 15 years, is that the security industry has been so guilty of creating a language that no one else understands. And probably I've seen it, people in the security industry either don't understand, or there's this one-upmanship, I know more than you. There's so many acronyms, there's so much jargon. In your efforts to try and educate your people, I've seen too many exercises where there is an expectation that you naturally understand this stuff. We don't. So it needs to be easy to understand. Get rid of jargon, get rid of acronyms, make it easy, make it plain English. Turn it to use real life scenarios, immerse the learner in scenarios in the workplace, or in particular at home as well, to make it relevant to them, stuff that they can relate to. And there's a lot of research to suggest that tell your people and educate your people how to look after their own or their family's information, which is their most precious information, and they'll bring those good, secure behaviours into the workplace as well. Ongoing and regular learning. The learning needs to be repeated. Memories are very, very fragile, so we do forget things. So create a sort of a campaign, something that is ongoing, something that is providing those refreshers and reminders so people reinforce the desired sort of learning outcomes. Use offline activities. A number of our clients work with us as well to host lunch and learn sessions, competitions, surveys, tests, etc., to reinforce all this stuff and to get their people talking amongst themselves, learning from lessons made. And another big challenge is a culture where, and this still exists in so many organisations, where someone does something wrong, they're punished for it. There's so much stick in this space, it's untrue. And we need to rebalance that. Sure, people who are consistent offenders are doing things that on a regular basis, having been told time and time again, sure, there needs to be some sort of appropriate punishment. But good behaviours need to be rewarded as well. And there's not many cases where that happens as well. People do learn in different ways, so we provide content that you can adapt and personalise both to the individual but also corporately as well. And for every single organisation, as I said just now, there is no one size fits all. Depending on the risk that you face, depending on your approach to learning, we provide that learning so you can design the campaigns that suit you and your people most effectively. Make it fun by providing multiple sort of ways in which you can learn. So use some of the really exciting techniques, learning techniques that are out there but are not really used in this area. So games, animations, videos. We've got just launched some audio stories as well. All different ways in which people can learn in all these areas. We've split cyber into 10 sort of subject areas, so we're providing training in sort of things like phishing, social media, online safety, information handling, etc., etc. So all of those little bite-sized chunks in all of those areas. And finally, you guys obviously need to measure the benefit of that. So we have no shortage of management information reports that you can create and design and tailor, again, for your organisations to look at progress, pass marks, speed at which people are taking it, identify specific areas of weakness in the training that you might be experiencing within your own organisation. There are some examples of screenshots of the learning that we provide. Matt and his team will be delighted to assist in any sort of demonstrations of those with you. Just to summarise, memories are fragile, so please do make sure that you are refreshing and reminding the key learning points to all of your people. Use all means at your disposal. Your people are your best line of defence in all of this. So they are eager. Many of them will want to work with you to design the most appropriate training for your people. There's a big insurance company that we work with who've got 4,000 cyber advocates around their organisation, 4,000. And these are people that want to learn and want to share the story across their teams. And the most important thing for us is the importance of stories. You've seen lots of stats this morning. At the end of the day, people forget this stuff. It's stories that people connect with. We live our life through stories. We tell stories all the time. So that's what we try to do in all of our learning, using these scenarios, relatable stories that people can really understand and think this is happening to me. And coming back to the leadership team and my final slide, we've done something at Axelos which we think is quite creative. The feedback to it has been great. So we wanted to understand and to demonstrate to boards in our client organisation why they need to get engaged in this and use a tool to try and get them more involved and more connected to this and asking more questions. So we wrote a story and it's called Waiting for Beginners, and it tells the story of a chief exec of a mid-sized organisation, the journey that he goes on when he suddenly realises something he did, and it's opening up a malicious email. Catastrophically puts at risk everything that he's built up over the last 20 or 30 years. Short story, takes about an hour to read. The feedback to this has been fantastic because it just is a human story. And it's got the good guys and the bad guys in here. Happy to share some reviews with you as well if you want. We've got some free copies in the room as you leave. Please do take a read. As I say, it's a cracking read. That final quote there from Warren Buffett, I think, says it all. He said that many, many years ago, before the digital age. It takes 20 years to build a reputation, 5 minutes to ruin it. That could not be a better quote for the environment that we're currently working in today. Thank you for that. Thank you for listening. I think we're now hosting a panel discussion, which Matt will MC, I think. So happy to take any questions from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I'm going to boldly try and summarise those two presentations with a couple of quotes as well. And I'm going to paraphrase them, so I'm not going to write them down. But one of them is hackers don't target technology, they target humans. And the other one is pound for pound, there is no more effective investment in your cyber resilience than in cyber awareness training for your humans. And I think that encompasses everything we're talking about today. And on the eve of GDPR and all the boring stuff we know about reporting those breaches, and we now know how those breaches are most likely to happen. We're ready for a Q&A. So if anyone's got any questions, we've obviously got human awareness training experts. We've got Ian, who's a GDPR expert, and will answer any tough questions that you throw at him. And you've got me as well, and I'll try my best. So if anyone's got any questions.
So I think these conversations are got more traction in normal organisations and even law firms. One of the areas obviously in which we're having these discussions in barristers' chambers, which is, I believe, is much harder to get that sort of buy-in and traction from everybody. Barristers are their own entity to an extent, and they're traditional workers, a lot of them. So how would you suggest delivering the value to an organisation that operates like that?
So we work with a couple of law firms, very big law firms, one in the top 20. I agree with you fundamentally, and the reason we're working with those two organisations is that they were implicated in 2 attacks, public attacks. So again, it comes back to this: we better not let this happen again to us. So they made contact, and we're now working with them. It's a very pertinent question, and as you say, law firms in particular are a difficult beast and a unique beast in that respect. There is one of the firms actually we're working with actually have read that story, is a managing partner, and it'd been given to him by a friend, and he told me that as a result of reading that, he had stopped 5 attacks on his organisation. Went down to the IT director and made contact with us. It's difficult. It's very difficult. I'd like to have a room full of managing partners in the room and just talk to them and barristers and see what their view is. I don't talk to many on a day-to-day basis, but I suspect that they are very divorced from this area because they've got far more important things to be doing. And that's the challenge, is to get, whether you're a barrister or whether you're a board director, is to get them thinking that this is something that is actually fundamentally going to affect their organisation, and it will do. And if it hasn't already, it will do in the future, and it might already have done because they just don't know about it.
Can I jump in? I think the trick is, excuse me, that actually they don't have more important things to be doing. The major problem that you have, whichever organisation you go to, and I like the term traditional employed, I know exactly what you mean, is persuading the people at the top that they have a problem. It's like being a recovering alcoholic or druggie. You have got a problem, and getting people to perceive that and then act on it is a struggle in any organisation. And I would say, from my experience dealing in major corporates, that usually around the board table you've got 8 or 12 super bright people, which is fantastic to work with, very challenging, sometimes a little bit too much, but very, very challenging and interesting. But the converse of that is, these are people who by definition think they know everything about everything. And it means that I would go in and with a presentation, for example, on business continuity, crisis management, deeply nerdy. But 5 people around the table knew at least as much as I did about it, because I had this experience in Alaska or in South America, wherever it was. And the only way you can get over that, as Nick says, is by making it interesting for them. Making them realise that actually, you know, this is not just about what I do in the office, but this actually affects what I do at home with my kids, with the iPad and all of that. I mean, I'm not a nerdy person at all. I'm a classicist by background. But once you start getting into this, it is really interesting. And it affects all of us, and somehow you've got to convey that.
Just to close that one down. All I would say is that law firms are no different from every other commercial organisation in this respect. And to emphasise that, the National Cyber Security Centre has just commissioned some research in academia around a 2-year funded piece of research around helping boardrooms across the country manage their cyber risk more effectively. Because what your question highlights the most fundamental challenge that we face in the UK and most organisations, this disconnect between the board understanding and appreciating they have to do something about this, and lots of people beating on their door saying, this is the information staring you in the face, we have to do something about this. And I'm pleased to say, so UCL won that research, and we are their sole commercial partner in that work, working with Henley Business School, and we're just about to kick that off. And that's going to focus probably initially on large enterprise or commercial organisations, but the end game is to develop a set of tools, techniques and learning and guidance and insight that boards in all organisations, whichever sector you're in, whatever size you are, to help them actually understand. And the approach we're taking is don't start from security, start from understanding how boards operate and how they manage all other operational risks and work backwards.
I've got something to add to that as well, which is a couple of us at Sprout were in a pretty large chambers yesterday, and out of the blue we were told that a barrister had left his laptop on the train a couple of months ago and had copped a pretty hefty fine. And the culture was don't tell anyone. It hadn't been shared internally. There was nothing to be learnt from that, apart from the fact that he also volunteered during this meeting that he was downloading his Hotmail into his corporate email at the same time, and the IT manager nearly fell off her chair. But the culture was to hide it away, to not talk about it. I understand it doesn't want it publicised, but at least internally they should be learning from that. And the idea in that room, the idea was to not talk about it whatsoever, and that's a pretty real example and a big fine, big uninsurable fine.
I think just on that point, I was talking to a partner at Daily last week who felt that there wasn't any reputational downside from their last year. They sell people from the virus now.
Well, their exiting CISO didn't share that view. So he made a speech around Christmas time at the Glen Eagles Legal IT event, and I can't remember the figures he put out there, but it was the low millions, and that was just the cost in cleaning up the mess and bringing in Rico to do a lot of that grunt work, and the reputation. There's definitely reputational damage because people are still laughing about it.
No, I actually find it quite irritating because I had two of my members with me who essentially turned to me afterwards and said, "See."
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So with a bit of luck, they're going to get fined soon, and that will hit them price.
Exactly. And during that DLA outage, actually, when they had no email, they resorted and publicly made it public. They resorted to personal email with your data, our data, personal email accounts. There's stuff flying all over the place, which will still be out there in an uncontrolled environment. So even if that person considers there's no reputational loss yet,
stimulation to actually put your training methods to tests and then show it to the managing board work. Does it have any additional value where they can come back and someone can say, "Oh, after using your training, we saw this email, and it's only because of your training we saw that," or conversely being able to go in and say, "Well, actually, here's the results. Yes, it was simulated, and yes, it was controlled, but in the event that this was real, here's the potential damage that you would have encountered."
Absolutely,
Engaged with?
and a number of our clients do exactly that. They do these so-called ethical phishing tests, and a common process is do the test, do our learning, do the test again, and in all instances so far, thankfully, the number of people that have opened up the email, then opened up the attachment has plummeted. The one thing I would say about ethical phishing tests, it's an interesting discussion in the industry about just how effective they are. Some of them can truly backfire because they're not communicating. The way you communicate them is really important, and it can blow up in your face because all of a sudden the company, or particularly a director, might say, we're under attack, we're under attack. No, it's a control. Why didn't you tell me? It's also the looking at the wrong thing. There's a couple of clients I spoke to last week, and they both said they did the ethical phishing test, and one of the consequences was that in both instances that one of their staff saw the test and told everybody else and said, this is a scam email, don't open it, not knowing it was a test. And they said, and both clients said the people managing the initiatives said, no, don't do that, we want to. That absolutely is a sign of success. If someone identifies it quickly and tells everybody about it, even if it's a test, obviously in reality, that's a good thing. So, and the other thing is, I can tell you what the results are going to be. If you do an ethical phishing test, I will tell you, you'll be shocked and horrified at the number of people that open up. So all I would say is the learning is the critical bit. The thing that makes the change is the learning. It's not the test. But yes, it's a very common approach that people do. And you're right, it's a good way of demonstrating to your seniors impact, and that's what they're looking to do. What's the benefit of the behaviour change? Are we seeing the changes in the behaviour? So,
just to pick up that last point, I think if you're dealing with a really recalcitrant leadership in a company, it can have a galvanising effect. One of the first things I did in Vodafone a long time ago now, was to, and this is a slightly different subject, but arrange for a microphone to be planted in their boardroom the day before a board meeting. Because we were in a new building in Paddington, all the latest and the best security. I just joined the company and didn't agree, but they wouldn't spend any money or do anything about it. And it was dead easy to get a microphone in a flower pot in the middle of the table where they were having a board meeting the next day. That had a galvanizing effect. But you need to be cautious. Several of my peers said to me afterwards, I would have got fired for doing that. Luckily, I had a good CEO.
Matt, how would you...
Business ending. So you've got people, process and technology around something like that. So you can use technology to stop that happening, to disallow untrusted devices. Will that work in chambers? No, because they want to plug in iPhones and everything else. So then you might revert to process. So you'll have a written document, a policy inside your organisation that says you must not do this. Will they read the policy? Probably not. And then you've got the people element, which is the training and the behaviour and the idea that if you found a stick, so there's a couple of good examples. If you find a stick in the car park, how many people pick it up and plug it in? Loads, like absolutely loads of people. To train that out of people, to make sure there's a culture of only using encrypted sticks when you're carrying data around, is a behavioural training answer. So if you can't afford the technology or you're not in a position to put it in place, then use the training. To answer your question directly, the risk is immeasurable. So it only takes one piece of malware on a stick to blow the whole thing wide open, or to lose that client's data the other way around.
I presented a Lloyd's of London event yesterday morning, and one of the speakers that we know well from one of the big insurers was talking about a claim that he's handling at the moment with one of their clients, where there had been people outside the street at their head office giving out USB keys with, and I've forgotten what you remember, it was something like, this is we're a new band or something like that, some new music, can you go and have a look at it or listen to something like that. And they had 150 taken and plugged into the system. So,
If we had giveaways that then included USB sticks, some people here would plug them in because you would trust us because we're nice people. And you would take them away and go, that's handy. You may only use it at home or give it to your kids, but people would definitely plug them in. And most machines will auto-run, so you plug it in and whatever executable on there will run. You don't actually have to click anything or do anything or get a second chance. There isn't one. You just plug it in and it's all over.
I mean, if you have visitors coming in or people doing presentations, and you may have malicious visitors that you don't know until it's too late.
Yep.
If someone gives you a USB stick, can you sort of contain it to one device and say, only use it on this device?
So you could have a presentation laptop which doesn't connect to anything. Even if you had it cabled to the internet, you have that in a DMZ that's not inside your network. So if your own computer gets infected at work, the first thing you should be doing is unplugging it. To isolate that threat, contain it, keep all the records so you can understand what happened, but stop it spreading. So that's the same principle in the first instance: is don't connect it to anything else. Get them to bring their own laptop in, or just have a dedicated one to not connected to the rest of your network.
Thank you.
This all comes down to basic cyber hygiene, and the analogy is clear with viruses. First rule, wash your hands. There are certain basic, simple rules to follow.
Anyone else? Any GDPR questions? God, must be fun.
How long have we got?
So she had a lot of conversations, not sustainably with us as well. What would you say the saturation would be of people versus process in these gap analyses that you're providing? So in the reports, how much of that report is related to people as opposed to the process?
Well, the report we do both really, so as an equal measure. What we tend to find at the moment is organisations have got the kind of basics in place. They've got policies and procedures that no one reads, never gets refreshed. You can walk around the organisation and speak to people and no one knows anything about data protection. They don't know about best practice. They don't know about the controls you've got in place. And it's a free-for-all at the moment. It is quite scary to be out there and walking to chambers and talking to people. The barrister I spoke to on Tuesday said, "What's GDPR?" It's happening, it's out there at the moment, and the people are just completely blissfully unaware. It's that mindset that it doesn't affect me, and they don't realise it affects everyone. And that's the most difficult message we're trying to get across now, is it affects every single person. You as an individual, you as a barrister who manages and controls data, and as an organisation. It affects everyone, every walk of life. So I think the most difficult part is we did the process, we did a review as the gap analysis, and understand the people and process, but there are massive gaps between having a process in place and getting the level of understanding there. There might be 10 people in the whole organisation who know there's a policy in place. There could be 600 people in the organisation who are completely blissfully unaware. They don't know about it because it doesn't affect them. It's not my problem, it's IT's problem. That's the biggest issue we've got now. GDPR belongs to the IT department. And it's not true. It's all about process. And the biggest thing now with GDPR is get the controls in place, have the evidence piece, get the processes working. Because we don't know what brilliant looks like, because the ICO haven't given us the guidance to say this is what perfect looks like. Get your controls in place, educate your people, and get them to a level of understanding that they know what the risk is and what their obligations are under GDPR. Elizabeth Denham did an article about 6 weeks ago around cybersecurity and cyber awareness. She said in the article, organisations that don't educate their staff and put best practices into place, put controls in place, will be liable to fines. They won't accept the fact that, oh, we had a breach because someone clicked on the email. Have you done the education piece? Can you evidence that you've done the ongoing training, the ongoing GDPR training, the cyber awareness? Well, if you can evidence that and there's still a breach, there'll be a more favourable outcome for you at the end of it. But their mindset now is, if you don't do it, you can't lean back and say, it's someone else's problem. It belongs to you. So education, biggest piece. Train your people, get your policies in place, drive that change. That's the best thing you can do at the moment.
Yeah, and I think getting people to take responsibility on an individual level, it's not just an IT department issue. So let's say a company around the corner, they had a breach, and we were in there helping them. And the breach was a man-in-the-middle attack on Office 365, so just username and password, no two-factor authentication. And I was talking to them about their response to it and what have they done. And they said, well, everyone's had training now, so we absolutely cannot have that happen again, reputationally, but also it won't happen because everyone's been trained. So I made a bet with them that I could get someone's password in less than 5 minutes. And I think they were expecting some kind of hack, the laptop to come out. But all I asked for was the phone list. And I phoned up 3 people in the organisation. A practice manager, so you know the kind of business now, a junior and a senior barrister, and 2 of them gave me their passwords in less than 5 minutes. I even introduced myself as something to do with cyber. We know you've been breached, but I'm just checking everything's okay, and they just gave me the details. Now they were convinced that wouldn't happen because they'd been trained, but their training, was an email, maybe get everyone in a room, tell them not to be silly, and that was it. And half of them didn't turn up, half of them didn't read the email, and they're still giving out their information today. And it wouldn't take an awful lot to work out who the IT company is for another business, phone up and say, I'm calling from this IT company, I think you're having some problems with your mailbox, I just need your password to test it. And they will give it to us all day long. Because they have no idea, and they trust another human. Or you're playing on some kind of emotion around your boss told me to do it because you've had some downtime, and they will give you that information. So the training there is key.
And separate your work accounts from your personal accounts. So when you go home, don't just give your child the laptop. Have a separate account for them, because that's the major area for risk of breach. Because kids play all sorts of silly games now. My daughter loves Roblox, she'll be on it all day if they give the opportunity to do it. But there's forums out there where kids will actually go into games, online stuff, and download this malicious software into your machine. Separated, sandbox stuff. Create a profile for them, which is sort of a guest account, so that risk goes away. Understand the risk to you as an individual as well as the organisation. It's just making sure the education piece is there.
Yep.
Let's say you're going to be receiving a subject access request in a couple of days' time, and your standard procedure as a company that receives one of these is to ask for a copy of the passport and
I mean, as long as you've got some email security in place or use some kind of file sharing technology that will give you chain of custody as well, understanding who's accessed it, who's created the document. You've got to follow those steps, right, to verify that person before you react to the SAR. So as long as you're following good practice, I think email's fine.
Yeah, there's no restrictions on the email. There is, as you said, there is risk for that information to be sort of picked up somewhere out in the wild, but having the controls in place. If you're worried about those kinds of things, you can ask the person to sort of post in a copy of their passport or driver's license. Again, it's the time limits they give you in terms of a subject access request. Just be wary that those kinds of things can happen, but a secure email is fine. There is a company now called Secure File Send, which you can sign up to them and send a file securely, which is encrypted. There's options out there.
One for Richard, is there some advice or a way to approach getting the end users more engaged in actually taking the training? I mean, obviously you talked about how you make the training sort of engaging so they retain the knowledge, but does it work for handing out a copy of mailing for beginners to everyone, or would you just mandate it as part of their contract, or like what advice can you give to try and get through to them this is important and have them, I wouldn't say eager to take the training, but at least understand the importance of paying attention?
It's a very good question because, again, in the last few months we've been talking to a couple of our clients who adopted our training and sent an email around to all staff saying we've got new training, go and do it. Now that doesn't tend to happen, so it doesn't tend to work. So we are in the process of developing a range of additional tools and techniques to allow an organisation to know how to understand, to best launch and manage that campaign, the word campaign that I mentioned earlier. One of the critical factors of success for us here, and we've validated that with our clients, is to get the ownership and support from the leadership team. So to get them to demonstrate and to communicate to all of their people, one, to demonstrate and to talk about just how important this is to them, not just in the work, but at home as well. And there's so many sort of examples in the press, the recent Facebook discussions, etc., about the importance of your own data and how to best look after it. Secondly, it's a really good opportunity for business leaders, people at the tops of organisations, to demonstrate to their people that they believe that they're as vulnerable as anybody else, and one of the big challenges of people at the top is that they think they're immune, so that makes them more vulnerable. And it's just a great way of building an environment where the staff know that this is a critical part of everything that they do. It's a bit like health and safety. Health and safety has changed radically over the last 25, 30 years. It's beginning to be sort of the expression that Richard used, wired into us, something that we do, something we think about all the time. That will take time, that will take a generation. And it's scary to think that we've only had mobile technology for 10 years, and there's absolutely, we're still at the early stages of actually getting our heads around the implications of this for the way in which we can both benefit and manage the risks at the same time. But yeah, it's a critical part of managing an active campaign with all of your people. So, just
to reinforce that, I mean, it's tone from the top every time. You've got to start from the top, and the health and safety example there is very, very important one. I've worked in, as I said earlier, telecoms, oil and gas, where safety is far ahead of security in terms of the importance is given. Senior managers are fired if there's a fatal accident on their watch because they're held directly responsible for it. Nobody in corporate companies is fired, or very, very rarely, because they've been responsible for a cyber breach. So you can change, somebody wise once said to me, excuse me, you can change attitudes in a year. It takes 10 years to change a culture. And we need to get in the same place. Nick is absolutely right, as we are with health and safety now. In Vodafone, huge emphasis over 10 years put on the fact, particularly difficult in India, in Africa, you can imagine wearing a seatbelt, being secure at height, if you're climbing up masts and so on. And yet, because it was constantly stressed, and people were fired, people get it very, very quickly. And now, I mean, I said before, I live in Italy. If I'm sitting in the back of the car and put on a seatbelt, everybody turns around and stares at me. But it's absolutely second nature, not least because I'm a Brit, but also because of the way it was drummed in Vodafone and the other companies where I've worked. We need the same response with security, and we don't have it yet.
And the other thing I forgot to mention is that, again, tone from the top, and this, for those guys are making sure that they're telling their people that they're not going to get sacked for putting their hand up. It's come back to Matt's example where, you know, a bad incident's brushed under the carpet. It's a great opportunity to say we need to talk about this more openly, and if you do something wrong, put your hand up. It's like not an analogy, but in the aircraft industry, the nuclear industry, when you go into those industries from day one, from the first hour, it's drummed into you. If you do something wrong, or you see something wrong or dodgy that you see happening, tell someone, because obviously the implications of that not being reported are catastrophic, could be catastrophic. So it's part of everything they do in those industries, is that, you know, it has to be reported. So we need to get to that same sort of mindset, but I suspect that's going to take a generation. And it's interesting, you know, you're talking about kids, you know, and there's been discussions about the problem with the boardroom is that you need younger people on the boards who understand technology. I fundamentally disagree with that, because youngsters don't understand risk, and this is all about risk management at the end of the day. It's not about technology, it's about managing appropriate risks relevant to your organisation.
I think just going back to your point, I found in chambers where we are, the best thing we did was purchase the weighing books, let the heads of chambers read them, and then let them pass it down to other barristers and get their feedback, and then you can look at doing something like this training in-house, and they're all aware of what's going on before you say trying to educate them. What it's all about.
And we've got some, using the same guy, we've also developed, there's some as well at the back there, we've called Stories from the Front Line. So these are working with friends of ours who've given us some real life scenarios, and the same author has heavily redacted them, but written very short, 3 or 4 page little stories that talk about and sort of dramatise the scenario, ending with the problem. So again, those are really good, short. You know, it takes 2 minutes to read. We were at another event. I spoke at another event actually with Jerome, and what we did was we gave the audience, here's the advice from the National Cyber Security Centre about phishing emails, and it's 1 page, and here's a story. There you go, have a look. Which of those are you more engaged in? And the NCSC advice was, don't do this, too much jargon, words that people don't understand. And then there was a story about Paul. And surprise, surprise, everyone said, well, this, I understand this. That is key to this, absolutely key to it.
Okay, I was just going to, oh sorry.
Discussion around legitimate interest, but it's also quite confusing. I just wondered if you have a simple way to describe it.
There's no simple way to describe it, unfortunately. I would say rely heavily on consent in most cases, especially for the legal side of things. When you first engage with the client, get the consent piece in place. Following on from that, have a legitimate interest for the reasons behind why you process the data. Try and document your legitimate interest so you've got an understanding, especially the barristers and people in chambers understand that you've got the consent in the first place when engaging with the client to give instruction or do legal representation, but also understand the legitimate interest part of it. I would do both as a sort of fail-safe, because there are loopholes in legitimate interest that could potentially cause issues later on, because people just think about GDPR. They don't think about the other acts and other controls in place, like the Children's Safety Act, the Mental Health Act. All those things have got small influences on GDPR. So define, if you can, in the beginning, get the consent in the beginning, and use the legitimate interest for the ongoing management of the case when dealing with personal data. I would recommend that belt and brace is the best way to do it.
From a marketing point of view, B2B, legitimate interest is legitimate. You know, you've got to be able to evidence it, like everything else in GDPR. But you didn't need to be one, if you haven't sent it already, you didn't need to be one of these people sending out an email saying, you know, we can never talk to you again. There was one in the paper last night where somebody, a school, sent an email out to all the parents saying, we can't contact you unless you sign up, you know, even in an emergency. So if you get legitimate interest, there's what are the other ones? I can't remember.
Yeah,
there's other consents protocols that you can use around, you know, I can't remember what they're called. Go on, help me out.
Anyway,
It's completely mental.
Some parents might welcome that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But for B2B marketing, it's okay. And those legitimate interests can be your own. They're not the interests of the recipient. They can be your own interests. They can be commercial interests. So if I think you would really benefit from using this, I can send you an email on that.
Okay.
That is okay.
I think the legitimate piece around child safety would sort of negate the need for them to do that as a school for parents. Just understanding those controls. It's kind of murky water at the moment because they've given us statements saying pursuit of interest or consent, but without clear definitions of how they're going to do it. There's conflicting information from the Bar Council as well. Unfortunately, barristers take the Bar Council as gospel. I don't agree with everything the Bar Council says. I think they've taken a view from a group of individuals but doesn't actually take into consideration GDPR as a whole. There's a lot of legal implications in the back of that they need to think about. But if you can, ideally, like Matt said, marketing business to business, legitimate interest is fine, but understand the reasons why you need to process that data. And that comes back to the privacy notice. Have your privacy notice be as transparent as possible, the reasons why you're doing it. It prevents these issues later on when someone comes back and goes, you didn't tell me you're doing that. Publish legitimate interest if you can, or have a copy of it within chambers, so everyone understands what legitimate interest is for you processing that data. But I would, as a chambers organisation, consent is the most important thing, I think, at the moment, because there's so many things that can catch you out later on.
Can I take advantage of this expert to ask something that I'm not clear about? I've got a lot of contacts on LinkedIn, and I suppose I would assume that implicitly they've given me consent to having their data because they've allowed me to contact them or befriend them, whatever it is. And on LinkedIn, if you're in contact with somebody, you have the ability to download the email address which they've given to LinkedIn as their contact address and so on. And I've done that, and it's quite a big database of people. Is that okay?
That's fine. There's no restrictions on that, especially because LinkedIn's such a public-facing tool. They do publish the information with the understanding that they will be sharing information with other individuals they contact within LinkedIn. It comes down to large-scale processing. You as an individual might have loads of people or connections through business relationships, through sort of meetings or through events. There's no restriction on that. It concentrates more on large-scale processing.
So if I'm using MailChimp to mail dump on thousands of people, that's
that would be a different thing, yes. That business-to-business relation, one-to-one relationship with individuals through LinkedIn, through these other platforms, is okay. But as an organisation, large-scale processing of personal data, there are restrictions around that. But again, they say that anything published in the public domain, you haven't got free rein to use it the way you want to use it, but do understand it is still personal data, so have some controls in place and understand the risks associated with storing that much information around individuals. But again, one-to-one relationships or through a group of people on LinkedIn or a social platform, there's no restrictions on that.
I think it's seen as a club, isn't it? In terms of clubs, so you join under those rules. There's extensions you can put onto Chrome actually, which will show you everyone's contact details regardless of whether you're connected or not. Again, which is perfectly legitimate because you put the data out there. Yeah, it's just what you do afterwards. Don't sell it.
Yeah.
Social media sites, and we're still waiting for the ICO to decide how they're going to react to that, and indeed what it means for Duncan Lewis, and also Anthony Gold solicitors, man in the middle attack, single factor authentication. They sent out 16,000 emails from their own genuine email accounts having been compromised, all with malicious attachments to their clients. And again, we don't know what the outcome of that is. Some people will have been infected for sure, whether or not that's measurable, but the impact on those businesses will be pretty high, and they're almost certainly going to have come from some kind of human interaction.